All right, let's dive in. Today, we're basically becoming literary detectives. We're going to tackle a huge mystery. How do we know what someone from the ancient world really wrote when all we have are copies of copies of copies? This, my friends, is the wild world of textual criticism. So to get started, picture this. You've just found an ancient manuscript, and on it is a single line of text. Back then, scribes didn't really use spaces between words, so it looks just like this. Goisnohere. Seems simple enough, right? But hold on, because there's a huge puzzle hidden in there. So yeah, what does it actually mean? The way you break up those letters, it completely changes everything. And this isn't just some fun little word game, it's a real problem that scholars deal with all the time. And believe me, the stakes can be sky high. Just look at this. Break it one way, and you get a powerful statement of faith. God is now here. But break it another way, and you get the complete opposite, a declaration of atheism. God is nowhere. Two totally different meanings from the exact same letters. So how on earth do you figure out what the author originally meant?
Well, solving this exact kind of puzzle is what a very special kind of scholar does. We're talking about textual critics. You can think of them as the detectives of the ancient world, sifting through clues left behind by centuries of scribes and copyists.
The scholar Bart Ehrman puts it perfectly. Textual criticism is basically the science of figuring out what the original words were when you're looking at a bunch of different, conflicting versions of a text. The whole goal is to piece it all back together and get as close as possible to what the author first wrote down. And here's the real kicker. For pretty much all ancient documents, and yeah, that includes the books of the Bible, we don't have the original version, what they call the autograph. What we do have, as Ehrman says, are error-ridden copies. And every single time a scribe copied a text by hand, there was a chance for a new mistake to sneak in. So, if every single copy is potentially flawed, you might be thinking, how do these detectives even begin? Where do you start? Well, it turns out they have a whole toolkit of methods for analyzing the clues that are hidden inside the manuscripts themselves. One of their key tools is something that looks like this. It's called a stemma. You can basically think of it as a family tree for manuscripts. Way up at the top is the original that's been lost. Then below that are the copies made from it, and then copies of those copies, and so on. By comparing all the differences, scholars can actually trace how a mistake got introduced and then passed down, which helps them figure out which versions are older and probably more reliable. Now, these little differences between manuscripts, scholars call them variants. They aren't all the same. They pretty much fall into two big buckets. Unintentional changes, which are just honest-to-goodness accidents, and intentional changes, where a scribe actually changed the text on purpose. Unintentional errors are usually just simple human mistakes. You know, a tired scribe might misread letters that look alike. For instance, in some Greek texts, the word for who looks almost identical to the abbreviation for God. You can imagine how that one little slip-up could completely change the theology of a sentence. Or, just like our God is nowhere example, they might accidentally squish two words together or split one word into two. But here's where it gets really fascinating. Sometimes scribes acted less like copyists and more like editors. They weren't trying to be malicious, they thought they were helping. They might correct a name in a genealogy that they thought was wrong, or they'd try to harmonize two different gospel stories by adding details to one to make it match the other. They were actively shaping the text based on their own understanding. Okay, so this brings up the big question. When you have two different versions, how do you decide which one is the original? Well, critics have some rules of thumb. The first one basically says the shorter reading is probably the older one, because scribes were much more likely to add a little explanation than to just delete words. The second one says the more difficult reading is probably the original, because scribes would try to smooth out a confusing phrase, not make one up. But here's the thing. Figuring out the original words. That was really just the beginning. All of this meticulous work cracked open the door to a whole new set of much bigger questions about these ancient texts. And this is where a distinction comes in. Everything we've been talking about so far, finding the original words, is often called lower or textual criticism. But that work paved the way for higher criticism, which uses history and literary analysis to ask those bigger questions. Who really wrote this? When did they write it? What were their sources? Why did they write it? The whole idea behind higher criticism, as the Oxford scholar Benjamin Jowett said, was to study the Bible just like any other ancient text, the same way you'd analyze Homer or Plato. This was a radical idea. It meant applying modern historical methods and treating the Bible not just as a sacred object, but as a historical document that could be investigated. And as you can probably guess, this new approach caused a huge stir. It started popping up in the late 1700s, and by the mid-1800s, a lot of religious groups saw it as an attack, an attempt to desacralize the Bible. Things got so heated that in the 1890s, an American professor named Charles Briggs was actually put on trial for heresy because of his academic views. I mean, wow. While these methods are totally standard in universities now, that debate is still very much alive in some circles today. So, after all this digging and detective work, what's the big takeaway? Why does any of this matter today? Why should we care about tiny variations in manuscripts from centuries ago? Because despite all the challenges, all the errors, and all the changes, the work of these textual detectives has been unbelievably successful. As Bart Ehrman says, we might never be 100% sure about every single letter, but we can be pretty darn confident that we have a fair approximation of what the ancient authors originally wrote. It's an incredible tool for connecting us to the past.
And that kind of leaves us with one last big idea to chew on. Our most foundational texts, the ones that have shaped civilizations, aren't perfect artifacts that fell from the sky. They are human documents passed down through centuries of hard work, honest mistakes, and even deliberate changes. And knowing that this very human process is at the heart of our history, well, it makes you ask, what does that tell us about our relationship to the past itself?